Sobriety versus Abstinence. And May is Mental Health Awareness Month. This is Wrestling with Recovery. Welcome to Wrestling with Recovery. I am your host, Zol, the podcast where we help those in recovery or those with loved ones in recovery or helping start the process. And as we do each and every episode, we do want to let you know that this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal medical advice. We are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast. This podcast is not intended to replace professional medical or legal advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or the management. And in the U.S., if you or someone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts or a crisis, please reach out immediately to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255 or text HOME, HOME, to the crisis text line at 741-741. These services are free and confidential. And following up from last week's episode, I do want to send a big thank you going out to my childhood lifelong friend, Jessica B. Her story, well received with a lot of folks out there. Heard a lot of great comments, inspirational messages, and really what I found surprising was reflective messages. So her story connecting on, I think, probably more levels than both her or I could have imagined. So if you missed out on it, go back to episode 3, the one prior to this. It's titled Jessica B's Journey. And you can check that out now on YouTube, Spotify, and anywhere else that you may be listening or watching, I guess, for that matter. All right, let's get right on into it. We start off each and every episode with the 3 count, a topic in the 3 count that we give 3 facts that are interesting, obscure, and can be downright terrifying at times. And May, yes, insert the cheesy joke here. I said it so many times last month. I'm sure people are sick of me saying it. Yes, it's May, and May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And all throughout this month, here on the 3 count, we are going to provide you mental health facts. So, without further ado, with this installment of the 3 count, 1 in 5, 2, 10 to 20 years, and 3, 46%. Leading off, 1 in 5 adults live with mental health illness in the U.S. today. So that's roughly, what does that come down to? About 20%, I want to say. Close to about 20% of adults in the United States. So it has been interesting to watch that number grow as not only more research has become prevalent, but also more acceptance and awareness of it. Number 2, 10 to 20 years. People with severe mental health disorders die 10 to 20 years sooner than the general population. Now, this is completely unrelated, but I found myself kind of in a reminiscent style of ways here recently. I lost a grandparent on each side of the family at a relatively young age. My mom's mom died whenever I was 7, and my dad's dad also died a few months earlier, if I remember right, if I have my timeline right in my head. And my mom's mom was 50, and my dad's dad was, I believe, 60 or so. And I've caught myself wondering here in the last few months, like, what would life be like if I would have had 10 to 20 years more of my grandparents? What would my life have been like if I would have lost them at 17 or even 27? Now, granted, that is kind of a slippery slope. I always try to be present. That is something that I am really trying to work on. Mr. Anxiety over here. Hi. So I try to be careful with that. But I also know that whenever I got into some of the darkest spots with my mental health, It was tough for me to see what tomorrow was going to be like, let alone what 10 to 20 years would be like. And now that I'm on more stable footing, now that I have some good streaks of sobriety underneath me, I really, I look forward to tomorrow. I look forward to turning 40. I had a buddy of mine. Hi, Mike. He turned 40 earlier in the week, and it's amazing how for a lot of us we get tripped up over a number, but really we got to look at it as a gift because there's not many that get to see 40, maybe even 35. Um, and I know as obviously as the circle of life goes, I think it's important to really cherish and make sure to look at each day as a gift, because unfortunately we don't know when our time is up. But I think that's what's even more so critical, to be compassionate for those that are battling mental health issues. Because while it's like, man, I got a lot to do in 10 to 20 years, it's not my time to go. For them, they're just trying to get through today and, face tomorrow whenever it gets here. So I think that stat right there really struck home for me, obviously, because I've been talking a little bit longer about it, because it's like I've been on the end where it's like, it was hard to see what tomorrow or the next week was going to be because you're just so pigeonholed in. And then conversely, right now, it's like, man, 10, 20, 30 years, I got a lot left to do. I got a lot of people still to tick off, and I got a lot of things to accomplish and make sure that I get to see my kids do. So I think this is a great opportunity to be compassionate, learn how to expand that compassion with those that are battling mental health illness, and sit with them in the discomfort too, if you can. Doesn't mean you have to go force yourself like, hey, you're depressed, get over here, I'm gonna sit with you in it. I mean, sometimes you have to get there, but other times not so much. But, compassion goes a very long way. And number 3 here on the 3 count is 46%. It is the percentage of Americans who meet the criteria for a diagnosable mental health condition at some point in their life. Now, obviously, I just pulled that off from the internet. What I think would be a fun study to go back and see is how that number has shifted and grown through the start of the millennium, and compared to the last 20 years of the millennium. So about from 1980 to 1999 compared to 2000 to today, given all the once in a lifetime life events we've all experienced in the last 24 years. But I would be curious to see how that number has grown, because I'll guarantee, I'd be willing to bet that that number is a lot smaller back then, and especially now as we've learned more and made leaps and bounds in studies and diagnosing and expanded the DSM-5. I would be willing to bet that has exponentially grown. So there you go. That is your 3 count. Sorry, I went on a little bit of a rant there, but it's my podcast and I can rant if I want to. Rant if I want to. All right. So this is actually today's episode is going to wrap up the foundational part of this podcast series. As I said in the intro, I have no idea what the end of this podcast looks like, but I knew at the very beginning I wanted to lay down the foundation. I wanted to show how there were a lot of terms that were being used interchangeably, but yet while they were close, they actually mean completely different things, and they truly do take on a life of their own. And so, as I was really thinking about the topic here today, I realized this is one that we really need to get into before we move on to the juicy subjects of addiction, choice, or disease. That one has been one of the most requested topics. So I think we're just going to go ahead and do it here sooner rather than later. Just at least maybe to strike up a conversation. But this one here, sobriety versus abstinence. whenever I did my research, I really felt like this was one of the terms that whenever someone says that they're sober and you think of abstinence, immediately comes to mind is, well, of course, they're one and the same. But whenever we look at them through different lenses, especially through recovery, it's like, I'm a really bad optometrist at this point. Okay, is it one or is it three? Is it two or is it one? Uh, this is why I did not go to optometry school, one of many reasons. But we get that understanding and it makes the conversation a little bit easier to have. And one thing I want to make sure to point out is that I want to do my best to stay away from, well, you need to, you have to. I want to stay away from you statements because I firmly believe everyone's journey in recovery is unique. There are situations in my life that is different from someone else's, that's different from another's. We may be, single fathers who grew up in military, but that may be where the similarities end. So that's why I want to make sure as I go through this that I really probably try my best to catch myself from saying, "Well, you need to," and whenever you find yourself, hopefully by using the I statements, it's something that you can find relatable and maybe shape it to fit your recovery journey or help you with the loved one in their recovery journey. So let's first start off with sobriety. Now, sobriety, the definition from Oxford, is the state of being sober, not drunk. All right, that's the episode for today. Comment, like, share, subscribe. No. I think as we found talking about recovery in terms that are used, the simple definition of not drunk is very limiting at best. Now, in a treatment setting, sobriety includes abstinence, which we'll talk about here shortly, but also encompasses things as behaviors, emotions, mental health, and goes on and on and on. So when we think about different addictions, and again, we challenge the thought of addiction. Sobriety is not drunk. Sobriety is not gambling. Sobriety is not smoking. Sobriety is not using. Sobriety is not shopping. You see how, interchangeable. It's a very simple definition that I think is universally easier for those who aren't used to recovery. It's easier for them to digest. Now, that being said, many in addiction recovery try to find that cure all. So I think that's why we lend so easily to sobriety. Don't drink, just don't use, just don't pick up, just don't overeat. Because we want an easy fix for a complex disease, complex choice, a complex addiction. Now, going back to episode 2, the one prior to Jessica's journey, where you can find on your streaming platform. Again, we identified and have established that the working definition of addiction in this podcast comes from Dr. Gabor Mate, and he states addiction is a complex psychological, emotional, physiological, neurobiological, social, and spiritual process. It manifests itself as any behavior that gives you temporary relief, temporary pleasure, but in the long term causes harm, has some negative consequences, and you can't give it up despite those consequences. When we use that definition, suddenly addiction takes on a whole new meaning and viewpoint, not just drugs, not just alcohol. So in case you missed out our chat about addiction, go back to episode 2. They're in the vault. Give it a listen. Really good stuff there. So let's talk about abstinence. Let's talk about abstinence, baby. Okay. I will limit singing on this podcast. I really do not feel like losing all 2 of my listeners already. Abstinence, definition from Oxford: the fact or practice of restraining oneself from indulging in something. Simple enough, right? Now let's break it down. The fact or practice. Yes, we're talking about practice. As we established all the way back in episode 1 in the vault, recovery is a process. So, abstinence, in theory, could be the first step, the first action of recovery. Now, I believe that as we look closer at this, simply just abstaining is not enough. Because, as you notice there in the definition, it says the fact or practice of restraining oneself. And I think the key word there is restraining. I feel like this is why we see so many relapse or lapses or slips or whatever you want to call it, because it is so exhausting to always having to restrain oneself from indulging in something. Whenever I read this definition and as I was prepping for this episode, the first thing that came to mind was tug of war. I mean, imagine yourself, you're on one end, and then the compulsive addiction, the addictive behavior is on the other, and there you have your substance, and you're trying to, tug away from that to win the war and getting back control, and yet the other side's tugging and pulling, and eventually you are going to wear out, because one, it's you, little you, against this big complex machine that seemingly never runs out of energy. And just the fact that we are restraining ourselves, we are physically, mentally restraining ourselves from indulging into whatever. I felt like whenever I got that granular, the light bulb finally went off whenever I look back at my lapses and relapses and slips. I'm like, there it is. Because I got tired of restraining myself from something that was giving me temporary relief over something that was really painful. Now, I believe this is also why, too, we move from addiction to addiction. So we move from alcohol to drugs. Maybe let's even go a little bit higher up. Let's say, okay, we go from shopping. Okay, well, don't have any money this month. I got to wait till paycheck. Okay, well, fine. We'll just, oh, hey, they've got 5 burgers for $20. Actually, that's probably true. Think about that. We move from addiction to addiction because we get tired of restraining. Okay, well, I'm not shopping anymore. So at least it's not, how many times I can't count how many times I've used that statement. Well, at least I'm not drinking. Well, at least I'm not, and it sounds like a little kid. Well, at least, and so restraining from something, we're just putting down one tug of war to go to the next tug of war. Oh no, hey, okay, well, that one looks like it's a little bit tired now. I think I can do that again. And the next thing you know, you're back into that restraining cycle. And I really love, if you can't tell, I really loved his work. Dr. Gabor Mate establishes not for us to ask, not why the addiction, but instead why the pain. Because we're going to jump more times than not. It's going to be easy to jump from addiction to addiction. We're numbing, we're changing one thing to numb with another. And so instead of saying, why the eating, why the gambling, why the shopping, why the sex, why the drugs, why the alcohol, why the pain? And that, for me, whenever I read that, made a huge leap for me with recovery. So we've established sobriety, we've established abstinence. Now let's put these two together, because as opposed to recovery and sobriety really being separate, we can actually see abstinence and sobriety work hand in hand. And the fact that abstinence is the action, we're restraining from indulging. Sobriety is the mindset. So look at the mindset that we mentioned in the recovery treatment setting. Sobriety includes abstinence, but also encompasses things such as behaviors, emotions, mental health, etc. Sobriety is more than just not. To just not indulge, that is abstaining, abstinence. Sobriety is the mindset of not drunk, not overspending, not overeating. And then we get into that mindset. Well, now suddenly we're having to completely change our behaviors, our beliefs, our routines. We're having to change a lot about us. I know I had to change a lot about me. Um, and then to tie it all back together, recovery is the journey. Recovery is the process, as we said in episode 1. So with recovery as a process, we have to start somewhere. And that's where abstaining. That's where we have to say, okay, we've got to identify whatever that compulsive behavior is. Then once the mind-altering substance or behavior is identified, then we can enter into a sober mindset. Or at least I was able to enter into a sober mindset. And I say we because I firmly believe this. I really do. I believe it in my heart. And I wish I had more scientific backing to prove it, but I don't. I haven't had enough hours in the day to really dig into it, and that's why I always make sure to put that disclaimer at the very beginning, because this is my journey. This is what worked for me. Maybe it works for someone else. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe someone's already tried this and failed. I don't know. Anywho, moving on. I believe this is why sober is subjective, and the sober mind becomes subjective because when you enter into a 12-step program, they say that you are, you admit that you are powerless over X. I think that's the number one step in any 12-step program. I have seen 12-step programs where the different groups, their rule is that you have to be sober. That's what it says. You have to be sober for X amount. But whenever we look at caffeine as a stimulant, okay, anesthesia for surgery, mind altering, you're numbing, you kind of get that granularity. Are you technically not sober anymore? Well, but it's not. Again, so this is where I think it's very important whenever someone goes into a 12-step program to maybe have that hard conversation and make sure that it aligns with where their journey is and what their beliefs are. And I think that's what makes recovery, sobriety journeys tough, but also worth it, because there isn't a set way. I know one of the common terms used is, if you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it. Okay, well, now suddenly let's talk about being sober. Kind of get into the weeds there. But again, that's where the journey, and you find your like-minded tribe, you find your like-minded individuals, and suddenly your journey becomes a lot easier. And I think this is too where day counts can get tricky, because technically, is it, if someone says I'm 12 days sober, okay, are we talking about overall sober, or are we talking about abstaining from your addictive substance, your addictive behavior? Like, what are we talking about here? Now, I think I know for me, whenever I entered into a 12-step program and entered into recovery and started the journey, hearing everyone's, I'm sober, I'm this amount of days sober, it became very welcoming and easy. But as I found myself relapsing, and as I started doing really challenging old beliefs and trying to do that deeper work, that's where I found challenges. And I think it's important in recovery to challenge beliefs. It's not to say that you're wrong or you're right. You just are. It just is. Once you find that state, that centerness, as the Buddha calls, the centerness of just is, that's where the transformation can take place. And that's why for me, I don't day count. I do have a tracker that keeps track of how many days I've got, the length of sobriety, lengths of not drinking alcohol, since alcohol has left my body. I do have that, but I think that's where counting days does get a little bit tricky, because especially for the newcomer that is into their recovery journey early on, maybe they build up 4 days, 7 days, 7 months, 7 years. And they're just, okay, well, I just didn't drink. And then they leave it at that. Well, now they lose all those days. and suddenly it's right back on square one, and the ego is a very fragile thing, and without doing the inner work, without doing the recovery, just resting on the laurels of day counting, it can be tough to get back on and give sobriety recovery a try. um and we're well, wow, man, I really went on a tangent here. I really, through all this, I know I use we and I believe and things like that. I really tried to stay away from you. I don't think I did a good job of it, but be as it may, that's why you will constantly hear me say that it is important to remember that your journey is yours. Okay. If someone says, well, you drink caffeine, so you're not technically sober. Okay. Well, that's a them problem. And it's clear that that group may not be it for me. If there was a cookie cutter way, if there was a map that whip out and say, okay, you're just going to do this, 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 and this, and you're fixed. I guarantee you, this podcast wouldn't need to exist. You wouldn't have all these self-help books. You wouldn't have people trying to piddle out fix all, cure all pills. No, just take this one pill and suddenly you can drink. I've been down that road and it didn't work for me. Honestly, the biggest thing for me that worked was a combination of individual therapy, working 12-step program, going to rehab, going to IOP, working with the life coach. It was a lot of different tools in to put into my toolbox, so that way, as different situations arise, I've got a different tool. It would be as if, for me in my journey, it would be as if all I had was a hammer, and I needed to screw in something into the wall. And I take a hammer, and I'd use the bottom of the hammer and tried to screw it into the wall, and said, it doesn't work. No, I just had the wrong tool for what was needed. Needed to expand the tools that I have available. And that's why I think there isn't just, as much as we want there to be a one size fits all, just don't drink, just don't shop, just don't get to bed with strangers. It's not that simple. It's a lot more complex. And because it is a complex journey, because until you go through it yourself, or until you see someone going through the recovery journey and they can't get past day 4 of whatever it is that they have the compulsive behavior on that's wrecking their life, until you have that compassion, it is very difficult to understand that struggle. But if you're willing to sit there and say, look, I don't understand it, but I'm going to sit there with you, and not to say that your boundary is limitless, that you'll tolerate anything, because I have learned that boundaries is the distance in which I can love myself and you at the same time. Sometimes that distance is short, sometimes that distance is near and far, as Celine Dion said. A lot of musical reference here. I'm probably going to get DMA'd or whatever they call it, whatever they call it, taken down. But because of, with as complex as the recovery journey is, for me, I found that instead of chasing the just don't drink, just stay away from, just stay busy, just once I started doing the work of what's the pain inside that I'm trying to numb, for the first time in 38 years of my life, I can sit here and say I've got a sober mindset because I am moving in ways that work for me and not against me. And I can't, words doesn't even begin to describe the feeling of that sober mindset. But once you go on that journey, and be gentle on yourself and get the right support and don't give up, whenever you have that moment, you'll know it. And you'll be like, I don't know how to describe it, but I had it. So that is the program for today. Thank you so much To everyone who listened in, hopefully you took something from there. If you haven't already, give us a like, comment, follow, subscribe, share on social, Wrestling with Recovery Pod, or on X, Twitter, at WW Recovery Pod. You can check out everything that we have there. So my name is Zol. I am sharing my journey. Glad to have you along with me. And until next time, bye.